Welcome back to the Mixology Talk podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Julia, and we're the folks behind A Bar Above.
So I help run A Bar Above and also help bars and restaurants improve their beverage programs.
I also help run A Bar Above, as you probably already guessed. And most of what I do is I work with factories, our shippers, our warehouses, and all the other people to make sure that we are making awesome bar tools and getting them to you.
So October is Infusion Month here at A Bar Above, and we are going to geek out on all things nerdery around infusion. So you're going to see infusion tutorials on the website and in our Facebook group. You're going to see infusion cocktails and a whole bunch of other things created with infusions.
I'm so thirsty just thinking about it.
So good.
And if you're going to be making infusions, like, say, this one or that one, you might need to strain it out after infusing.
That's true.
If you do need to, you should get one of these fancy dancy fine strainers. These are actually our fine strainer. They're a little bit bigger than most, as you can tell, which makes them good for this purpose. They're also extra fine. And by that, I don't just mean they're good looking, although
pretty great.
Pretty good looking. It means there is an extra fine mesh, which is going to catch all those little bits, all those little seeds of your jalapenos, or those are serranos, aren't they? And all those little bits of lemon zest. They will all get caught in this awesome strainer. So if you need one of these guys, for the whole month of October, they're 15% off with the code Infusion Month. You can go and pick these up at shop.abarabove.com.
Meanwhile, let's go ahead and start talking about infusions.
So I got to start with a story. It's always good to start with a story, right? If you are in our Facebook group, you may have already heard this one, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it's a funny story. When Chris and I were first dating, he was obviously trying to impress me, and he told me that he had his infusion machine going with his famous fig-infused vodka.
It's true.
Now, this was all very convincing and very impressive, and it managed to get him a second date. And subsequently, I realized the truth.
It's super easy. It's just booze and fruit.
It was a bucket. His infusion machine was a bucket.
Fancy infusion machine.
Filled with vodka and chopped up figs.
It was great. It worked though. Got my second date.
It was delicious also. But as you can tell, infusing is not a complicated scientific process. No lab coats required, no big goggles, although optional, those can be kind of fun. But none of these things are required. Infusing is actually super, super easy. So what is an infusion? If Chris's fig bucket qualifies, what exactly is that? And I think to oversimplify, in the context of the bar and sort of liquid ingredients, for the most part, an infusion is just the process of putting something in something else so they begin to taste like each other. So for example, if you were to put dried apricots in vodka and wait it a little while, the vodka would start to taste like the apricots and the apricots would start to taste like the vodka. Absolutely, and that's usually one of the very first steps a lot of bartenders and home bartenders make to making their own creative cocktails is infusions. So you can pretty much infuse anything. Alcohol is generally the first step, but if anybody's made infused oils or you could do salts and sugars for infusions, and what's the vinegar? The drinking vinegar, I can't think of that. Yeah, shrubs are another great example of infusions. Absolutely, and I think you may have already made infusions. You've probably already made infusions because things that qualify as infusions are tea, coffee, spa water. Spa water! It sounds so much fancier than what you get water and you put fruit in it and then you wait and then the water tastes like the fruit.
Right.
Like, it's so basic, and yet that is truly an infusion. And that just shows how simple it is. Yep. So when it comes to infusions for the bar, typically you'll see more or less two camps. You're going to see infused alcohol, like this guy. This is a lemon peel infused vodka on its way to becoming limoncello.
Yep.
And you're going to see infused syrups, which are typically either simple syrup or rich simple syrup or some version thereof that has been infused with flavor. These are usually the two most common types of infusions you're going to find behind the bar.
Absolutely. So we'll just kind of talk about some of the ingredients that you will likely infuse. Like actually, we haven't said this yet, but you can infuse any vodka or any alcohol. So it could be vodka, it could be rum, it could be bourbon. It really depends on what you want that final cocktail to taste like. Just find that specific alcohol that you want to use and kind of go off that. Vanilla extract, another one that we use all the time,
exactly,
right?
Absolutely. Not necessarily behind the bar, but it is an extract, which is in a way an infusion.
Right.
And most bitters and tinctures behind the bar are all just very highly extracted infusions.
Absolutely.
And we'll talk a little bit more about bitterness a bit later, but again, this is something that you may not realize it, but you run into it all the time.
Yeah, so as far as ingredients to infuse and deliver flavor into alcohol, usually the first step a lot of people make is infusing fruit. And that's a great starting point. Strawberries, watermelon, anything with a really high water content and a high sugar content is a natural kind of stepping stone into making a flavored alcohol.
Now you will notice that when you've got that high water content, you're going to see a little bit less of that flavor transfer.
Right.
If you put a slice of watermelon into a big jug of water, you're not going to have super watermelon-y water. And the reason is because the cells of the watermelon are kind of already filled with water. And so there's not as much transfer of material there. Whereas if you were to use dried fruit, which I suspect is what Chris was about to say, like I mentioned earlier, dried apricots, even something like raisins, not to be ridiculous, that could actually be really good.
You could totally do that, yeah.
Then you have the benefit of the water already being removed so that whatever you're infusing, say alcohol or water, would take the place and you would see much more flavor transfer.
Yeah, and one of the other things to consider when you're doing fruit, basically with high sugar content as well, is sugar isn't very soluble in alcohol. So it's not going to melt and dissolve into the alcohol very well. If you've ever tried to put literally just sugar inside of a bottle of alcohol and shake it, it doesn't dissolve readily like it would in water, so it doesn't extract very well either. So for items like that have a high sugar water content, you may want to choose a different pathway. I mean, I highly recommend it. It's going to pull the aromatics out, but if you want that flavor profile, a puree or a simple syrup with those fruits would probably be, you may want to experiment with that and might be a better choice.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that is a really good point, is that not everything is the best choice for infusion. If you're going to be infusing, usually we would go for things with low water content, stuff like herbs, dried fruit again, peels, things like that are going to be a really good choice.
Yeah, so along those lines, teas are going to be really good as well. Coffees make a really cool infusion. You can do a Kahlua like that. One of my favorite things is herbs. You can do dried herbs, you can do fresh herbs, and it really pulls out those aromatics from those herbs. And it's definitely a lot of fun during the summer and spring.
And if you're looking for like a really, like the very first stepping stone into infusions, I would encourage you to take a look at tea. The reason is twofold. First of all, you've probably already made tea before, so it's a pretty easy way to go. And secondly, because there are so many teas out there.
Yeah,
and many
absolutely.
of them even include dried fruit, frankly, if you're looking at like a strawberry tea, which does exist. And that's a really good way for you to get the flavor, because frankly, the tea manufacturer's job is to give you something that infuses well.
Absolutely.
So somebody's already kind of done the hard work for you, and they've also managed to give you something that's really consistent. So it would be easy for you to replicate once again, because you just use the same amount of tea bags or loose leaf tea. Speaking of which, if you are using tea, I can't help, I have to say it. If you are using tea, go ahead and quadruple the package instructions.
Yeah, that's a good starting point for any infusion. The beautiful thing about infusions just in general, and we may talk about this here in a second, but you can always dial it in or out however it is. So over-infused is better than under-infused. Because if you over-infuse, and if you're doing a lemon vodka, for example, and you don't want as much lemon, just put more vodka in it. Just like thin it out, dilute it down, and you can kind of nudge it to exactly where you want to go, and then correct your recipe after that.
Absolutely. So if you're looking for a really good starting point, tea would be a really good place to start. But again, Chris normally just quadruples the recommended dosage. So if it's, if the box says to use 1 teaspoon in 8 ounces of water, then you go ahead and use 4 teaspoons, and that'll give you a nice heavy infusion, which then you can water or vodka down as necessary.
And one of the other things that are really fun, as far as materials go, are peppers. You can see here, if you're on YouTube, we've done a Serrano and jalapeno vodka. We're going to do that for Bloody Marys, which we filmed for the Facebook group. But also other peppers like black peppers or Szechuan peppercorns. Dried peppers make a really, really cool infusion. And it's always got that kind of familiar haunting note that you're like, what is that flavor? What's that aroma that's in my Manhattan or it's in my margarita or something like that? And it could be pepper. And pepper, there's so many peppers.
If you are infusing peppers, keep a close eye on it because they infuse fast.
Very quickly. Very absolutely.
Fast. I wouldn't, make a infusion with a whole bunch of Serrano peppers and wait 2 weeks. That might be much, much too long. I mean, with some peppers, you could see it even being done in days or hours.
So one of my fun tricks that I like to do from time to time is actually just put jalapenos in a fine strainer like this and pour the cocktail through it. So you kind of get just this top note of heat, but you get a little bit of aromatics, and people are just kind of like, what is that? And then you tell them, they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. But
that's a great idea.
That's how intense peppers are and how quickly it will infuse. So yeah, just be careful. Once again, you can kind of nudge it one way or the other, but for the most part, peppers are a great starting point too. So how exactly do you set up a infusion then? Well, it's pretty easy. I think we kind of covered that already. You throw a bunch of booze in a bucket or leave it in the bottle and just throw a bunch of material that you want to infuse into it. Now, there are definitely considerations that you want to think about when you're doing infusions. Maybe we should start off with like syrups.
Sure. I think that's a great idea because we've kind of talked about two different kinds of infusions. You've got syrup infusions and you've got booze infusions. So let's talk about syrups just to start there. When we say syrups, I think we're typically talking about
simple syrups.
Simple syrups, water and sugar. Now, the thing about infusing simple syrup is that there's already some stuff in it. You've already dissolved some sugar into the water, and so that can actually interrupt a lot of the flavor transfer in your syrup. So what I know Chris often does, in fact usually does when making infused syrups, is he'll infuse the water first.
Right.
Strain out that whatever that flavoring ingredient was, and then turn it into a syrup. Now this gives you a couple tricks. First of all, it means that you can really dial in your flavor without worrying too much about the sugar level. And secondly, it means that once your flavor is finished, you can make it into as rich of a simple syrup as you need. You can make it a standard simple or a rich simple, and you don't need to, again, worry about it messing with your flavor extraction.
Right, absolutely. Or even a lighter style syrup. Sometimes you don't want that 1-to-1 ratio because you have sugar already in one of the other products or in other ingredients. So you could really kind of dial it in, make it once, write down your recipe, and then it should be pretty repeatable after that.
Right. And one thing that's nice about using water, and this works, I would arguably with the syrup as well, is that when you're infusing water, you can do it at a high temperature.
Right.
This is not typically something I would recommend with alcohol.
Yeah, it could get really dangerous. Alcohol is, as we all know, super flammable, but when you get it up to temperature and you start to see it evaporate, that's when it gets super, super flammable.
Don't do it.
I've made stovetop liqueurs a couple of times, and it'll go up on you, and you got to be very, very careful and very mindful of that. Wouldn't recommend it.
But thankfully, with syrups, you don't have to worry about that. So what you can do is you can, for example, if you're making a tea syrup, go ahead, fill a saucepan with water and loose leaf tea, and
let it go.
Turn it up.
Yeah,
you don't have to worry about the temperature. And adding that heat makes the molecules move around faster, which makes the flavor transfer more quickly.
Exactly.
And so it can make the whole process go more quickly.
Much faster, absolutely. So a couple other things to consider, and this kind of goes with syrup and with alcohol as well, is the surface area, the ingredients that you're going to be pulling from. For example, if you have a cinnamon stick that you throw in bourbon, which was one of the infusions that we're doing right now, it's going to infuse a lot slower than if you were to throw a fistful of cinnamon powder in there. There's a lot of other reasons that you probably shouldn't do that anyways, but these are things to consider when you're actually putting together your infusion. Think about how much time you want, how much extraction you want, and play around with the surface area. This one we did just kind of broke up the pieces so it infused a little bit faster. So instead of like a month or 2 months,
Right.
Hopefully it'll take a couple of weeks.
So if you are just listening in, we have a bottle of, this was bourbon?
Bourbon. Mm-hmm.
This is bourbon infused with a bunch of crunched up cinnamon sticks, which is mid-infusion. It's got a couple more weeks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
But again, to Chris's point, we didn't have to crunch up the cinnamon sticks, but if we hadn't done it, we'd need a whole lot more time.
Yeah, and one of the other factors that you can think of, when I do infusions, one of the things I think of is tea. So when you have tea and you have hot water, depending on the temperature of your water is one of the things that's going to influence the extraction rate. Too hot and you're going to pull off a lot of bitterness. Too cold, you're not going to get all those deep flavors from the tea. Alcohol is kind of similar in that regard too. The higher the proof, think of it like temperature. The lower the proof, think of it like cold heat exchange, basically. So you really kind of play with some of the variables as far as your alcohol content, because Everclear is not always the best option for you, because it can just basically over extract everything, turn everything way too bitter, and then you're not going to be able to use it.
Right, so that's a really good point. If we start to talk about alcohol infusions, I think the very first thing to talk about is what are you infusing into?
Right.
And to your point, proof is a really big component of that. In general, the higher the proof of alcohol, the higher the extraction, the faster the extraction is going to happen. But that's not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
You may not be looking for all those bitter notes, and that just may not make sense for what you're going for. And furthermore, I think another thing that I hear people say is like, oh, well, it's just an infusion. I can get the cheapest, crappiest stuff.
Yeah.
Which, I see where you're going with that, right? You're not going to want to spend $50 on a bottle of vodka just to infuse it with some, I don't know, peppers or something, because those peppers are going to cover up a lot of those really subtle flavor notes that you just paid for. But on the other hand, if you get the absolute bottom of the barrel, if you get the absolute worst vodka, then, you're just garbage in, garbage out. You're never going to be able to resurrect something that's just really poor quality. So, I know, what price point do you typically aim for with your infusion grade vodkas?
Yeah, I think basically around $15, $20 is a good kind of benchmark for it. Basically, if you wouldn't use it in a cocktail, don't use it in an infusion. Don't skip out on it. So that's kind of my general rule of thumb, is 15 to 20 for vodkas. For bourbons, which are typically a little bit more expensive for good reason, you may want to bump it up $5 on each end. So maybe $20 to $25 for a decent bourbon. Four Roses makes a fantastic bourbon. There's a lot out there that you could use to play with. Same thing with gins and everything else, tequilas, rums, name your spirit. So yeah, just some things to consider when you're going to come up with a cocktail with an infusion. Think about the quality of the spirit that you're going to be putting in there as well. Now,
do you think that there's a big difference between infusing with a aged brown spirit versus a unaged clear spirit?
I don't think so. I think it just depends on like the flavor profile that you're really trying to go for. Right. I think some just marry up better than others, like hard spices and bourbon or anything that's been barrel aged. It kind of makes sense because you're pulling a lot of those flavors out of the barrel already. So just kind of matching up the flavor profiles is probably how I would think of it more than anything. If you're going for a really neutral, very clean infusion, obviously gin or vodka is probably going to be where you head with something like that.
Or even a white tequila, blanco rum.
Right, exactly.
A lot of those clear spirits are a good place to start. So going back to actually starting your infusion. So what I have right in front of me right now are 3 of our sort of halfway finished infusions. And what you have probably already noticed if you're watching on YouTube is that 2 of the 3 are basically in the bottles that came in.
Right.
What we've done is probably pulled off an ounce or 2 of each.
Had a cocktail with them.
There you go. They give it a taste. And then put the booze back in the bottle with whatever we're infusing it with. The bourbon has crunched up cinnamon sticks. The vodka has sliced up peppers. Then we also have a limoncello as well, although that is in a mason jar because we ran out of jars. So that's basically how you start your infusion, is Put whatever you're infusing into the same space as your liquid. And now the next step, of course, is to wait. And the thing that's great about infusions is it's not like a cake where you have to wait for it to be done. You can actually go and taste it along the way. And I would encourage you absolutely do that.
Right.
Especially if you're doing a brand new infusion you've never done before, you may not know how long it's going to take. And so I would taste it at the beginning so you have a baseline, and then go ahead and taste it at some frequency depending on what you're infusing. If you're infusing something that's dry with a lot of surface area, or even peppers, something that's going to infuse really quickly, taste it often, maybe every hour, maybe every 15 minutes, because that could go very quickly. If you're tasting, if you're making something that you expect to go much more slowly, like for example, this, the cinnamon stick bourbon, I don't think we've even tasted this guy yet.
Not yet.
It's been about a week. But again, what you're going to want to do is just keep an eye on them, give it a taste with some degree of frequency, give it a stir every once in a while, and then keep it in a cool, dry place. Make sure your container is completely airtight. You definitely don't want gremlins getting in there, although obviously with this level of alcohol, you'd probably not
You'd probably be all right.
You're probably not going to have much growing in there.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, you're just going to want to set it aside and keep, I would say keep an eye on it, but I guess it's keep a taste on it.
Yeah. One last thing to consider is the amount of material. So this is also going to affect how much extraction you're getting. So if you want something very quickly, I guess the perfect scenario for a fast extraction would be high surface area, probably not a lot of water content, and just pack that thing full of material that you want to extract. Mm-hmm. And that should get you a pretty fast extraction. So for the case of this limoncello, I actually used a microplane for half of it and then peels for the other half. So that microplaned lemon zest is going to extract very, very quickly.
And that's due to the high surface area.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. So,
but again, if we wanted to extract even more, we could just put twice as much lemon in here, and that would increase the extraction speed as well. So while we may all have kitchens filled with infusion machines like this one, there are some more interesting quote-unquote machines that you can use for more interesting methods. What I would say is probably the most basic one of which is kind of like a French press, which in a way is just a jar with a built-in strainer. That's a great one that you can use, especially for hot infusions. Obviously, you can use it for coffee, that's what it's made for, but it's a great one to use for things like tea infusions and maybe even some spices and herbs would work well in that one too. But of course, that's just the beginning.
Yeah, there's quite a few other like advanced techniques using that you can use for infusions, and kind of endless as far as your imagination on where to take this. But I know Izzy Whippers, the whipped cream containers, are a great way to infuse very, very rapidly. I haven't had a lot of success with it, but I know David Arnold covers it in his book, Liquid Intelligence. So if you have that, definitely check that section out. And if you don't, buy the book. It's worth it. Super good.
I'll put the link to the book and I'll link to the method into the show notes, which would be mixologytalk.com/162.
Absolutely. But the AeroPress, a cool little coffee machine that you basically just pressure down, I've used before with items that are really heavy extractability, like coffee or peppers, and things that oxidize. So for example, I made a really, really cool coffee sweet vermouth infusion, and it was just simply espresso grind, AeroPress, and sweet vermouth pressed through it, and it doesn't take long, and it just gives that little hint of coffee that you pick up on the palate. Now, there's two other ways that are a little bit more on the advanced side, and I'm sure if you've worked in a restaurant or if you're kind of a geek home cook, you have probably crossed paths with this, and that is a vacuum bag with a sous vide. So the sous vide is an immersion circulator that really lets you target specific temperatures, and it's great for extractions. We actually just did a podcast with Lucas Huff last week, and one of the things that he mentioned is the sous vide machine is really great for pushing back the flavor profile to be later in the palate, which I thought was super, super fascinating. So that would be something to try. And one last one that I heard about but haven't tried is one of those sonic cleaners you get from like Harbor Freight, and using that because the sonic component of it vibrates everything super, super fast. So the infusion happens in like hours.
So do you put like the vacuum bag into it?
Right. So water
it's
bath.
A combo.
Right, exactly. Water bath, from my understanding, I could be wrong, but it was water bath, vacuum sealed infusion, toss it in there, turn on a sauna cleaner, come back in like an hour or two, and it's basically done.
We're gonna have to try that.
Right, absolutely. I'm not excited about that.
We can
at all.
throw some stuff in there too for cleaning while we're at it.
Right, exactly. But those are the kind of like next level geekery. I mean, just top of the top for infusions. If you have others, I would love to hear other techniques that you guys have used that have worked for you.
I have heard about people attempting using the pressure cooker to infuse alcohol. And I have to say, you know how earlier we mentioned it's really dangerous to use alcohol over the stove? This is like that times 10.
It's like creating your own bomb, basically. I mean, the idea of adding pressure to alcohol that vaporizes at like 73 degrees, that just like freaks me out.
And then also, of course, there's a heat source as well. So I think it's a very dangerous approach. I know some people have done it successfully, and by successfully meaning they still have their eyebrows, but you may not. And I think it's really important to remember with all of these techniques that we are still kind of playing with fire, and it's really important to make sure that you're doing it safely. So keep the heat elements and the pressure elements away from the alcohol elements. However, you could totally use a pressure cooker for a syrup.
Absolutely.
I could absolutely
highly recommend it.
You could literally just put a couple inches of water into your pressure cooker, add a bunch of lavender or even like maybe something harder like rosemary, cinnamon. That I could see that working really, really well. Even some dried fruits, things like that. Then go ahead and go through your pressure cooker cycle, let off the steam, let it cool, strain it out, and then add as much sugar as you need to make your syrup. And
I'm gonna have to try that.
I'm really thirsty.
Yeah.
So whether this is your very first time hearing about infusions or you make them all the time, I would say that you should consider joining us in our Craft Cocktail Facebook group, because this month we're going to be making all kinds of fun infusions. You've actually, if you're watching on anywhere with video, you've probably already seen some of them. So you can come along, come mix with us. We're making a tea infusion cocktail, we're making limoncello, we're making a pepper infused Bloody Mary, and our very own
cinnamon bourbon.
Cinnamon bourbon. You can come and make these infusions along with us. And we're going to be having a contest this month.
That's right.
I don't know if it's a raffle or a drawing, or I don't know what it's called. But basically, if you share a picture of an infusion that you are working on, you'll be entered into a raffle to win some store credits. You should definitely join us, show off those infusions, give it a try. It really is that easy, and we would absolutely love to have you. The link is going to be at abarabove.com/groups. Or, of course, you can just hop on over to the show notes, which is going to be mixologytalk.com/162. Yeah. And in those show notes, we're also going to have links to all of the techniques that we mentioned today, and all of the stuff we talked about.
Yeah, so if you're not part of the group, hopefully we will see you there soon, and we'll talk to everybody in a bit.
See you then.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Welcome back. It's been a while. Missed you.
Hey.
So October is Infusion Month over here at A Bar Above, over here at A Bar Above, here at A Bar Above. Here. Right here. Okay. One more time.
But.
All right. You ready?
Oh wait, pinkies up.
Pinkies up!
So while we may be all blah 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 blah.
Spicy! Your infusion ass shirt.
I am!
Let's do the infusions.
What's infused?
Fire up that infusion machine.